One of the great challenges of the 21st century is how mankind can be a better steward of our environment. Habitat loss, mass extinction and climate change threaten so much of the natural world. As settlements expand, humans shape their environment to suit their needs, leading to damage, fragmentation and the destruction of natural landscapes. The 21st century is also a time of unprecedented interconnectedness and access to information. The increased speed of technological development, as well as an increased awareness of environmental challenges, has heightened the focus on ecological and conservation research. To mitigate damage, researchers have worked tirelessly in the field to understand human activities and their impact. Academic projects led by research institutions, surveys by government departments and non-governmental organizations, as well as the recent upsurge in citizen science, result in a wealth of data, much of it available to the public in some form. Getting the most out of such datasets, capitalizing on their hard work, is critical for understanding human impact on our environment. Traditionally, researchers in the life sciences, including ecologists, rely on statistical methods to test correlations between variables. However, although statistical tests are indispensable for finding relationships between factors, they do not account for causal mechanism. In his seminal work on causality, Judea Pearl introduces the concept of the causal diagram to harness intuitive human understanding of cause and effect. Since then, causal diagrams have been used widely in fields such as medicine and economics, but, in my opinion, have so far not been used to their full potential in ecology and conservation. Pearl's causality is a powerful methodological framework that can be applied to understand different variables within ecological systems. Let's illustrate causal diagrams with a small example from epidemiological modeling. Say we want to understand dengue and malaria, two important tropical diseases. Now, since this is just going to be a toy diagram, we assume that the only thing immediately affecting both dengue and malaria is mosquito abundance. How many mosquitoes there are in a given season. So here we have some mosquitoes. Now we illustrate that they affect those diseases by drawing arrows between them. Now, mosquitoes themselves don't just come out of nowhere. They need certain conditions to thrive. And two factors are temperature and humidity. Now, temperature and humidity clearly affect mosquitoes. If it is too cold, they can't survive, and equally if it is too dry. This would be an example of a causal diagram. It has some consequences. For instance, note that there is an arrow from humidity to mosquitoes and from mosquitoes to malaria, but no arrow directly from humidity to any other variable. That means that the entire effect of humidity on the diseases comes through their effect on mosquitoes. If we would know how many mosquitoes there are, then we do not have to care anymore about why the mosquitoes are there. It's the mosquitoes themselves that have the impact. This is known as a mediator, because mosquitoes mediate the impact of temperature or humidity on dengue and malaria. Similarly, mosquitoes are the only link between the two, but note that in this case the link is not a directed arrows, so we can't go from one to the other in the direction of arrows. So that means that dengue does not actually cause malaria or vice versa. But because both of these illnesses will be very common in areas where there are more mosquitoes, they will still be correlated. Areas with high dengue rates are likely to have more mosquitoes, which are likely to also have higher malaria rates. Lastly, we see that there is absolutely no arrow from temperature to humidity. We could think that there is a path here, but that path is a joint consequence that doesn't actually render those dependent. So an important consequence of this diagram is that temperature and humidity are independent. They have a joint consequence, mosquitoes, but no joint causes. So we expect them not to be correlated. Of course, this is a very simplified diagram, and in reality, there are many more factors that might confound temperature and humidity, so that might render them dependent after all. For instance, meteorological phenomena can clearly affect both of those variables. This is a very simple example. The real world can be far more nuanced. One reason is our own species. Ecology and human behavior are intimately linked, as humans compete with other organisms for the same resources. For instance, Bavaria, where I live, has many highland areas, as well as lakes and rivers, once rich in biodiversity. Nowadays, wild, free-flowing river systems are essentially confined to protected areas. Humans build dams, fortify riverbanks, and construct bridges and other structures to adapt the environment to their own needs. As a result, ecosystems and organisms typical of these habitats are threatened with extinction. The gravel banks of free-flowing rivers support a unique type of vegetation, central to which is the endangered species Mercaria germanica, adapted to the highly fluctuating gravel conditions of these unregulated river systems. Mercaria germanica is an indicator of this unique habitat type, endangered in many areas of Central Europe. Indicator species reflect the health of a habitat, so its presence or absence tells us whether an ecosystem type is viable there. Mercaria germanica grows on gravel riverbanks, rapidly colonizing an area after a flood or other perturbation to the river. Its root system binds the gravel and sandy ground, allowing other species, such as willows, to establish. This budding diversity of plant species then paves the way for animals to thrive in this environment. Building an ecosystem in this way is referred to as succession, and Mercaria germanica is a pioneer in this process. Scientists have already been investigating factors affecting year-on-year Mercaria germanica survival in northern Italy. For example, researchers from the University of Padua painstakingly collected data over a period of over 10 years from over 100 sites throughout river basins in northern Italy. They assessed factors such as channel width, altitude, whether a site is in a protected area or not, and the presence or absence of check dams in an area. This dataset is very valuable as, being an endangered species, Mercaria germanica is rare, and therefore data on the species is inherently limited. This poses a problem for approaches that rely on large datasets for statistical power, as it is very difficult to increase the sample size. There's also the issue of how we deal with human factors in the system, which includes protected areas, check dams, and riverbank protections. These factors may well share a confounder or a mediator. Let's collect the different variables that we've observed and see if we can fit them to a preliminary causal diagram. So we certainly have a record of the altitude at a given location, and we also have a record of the width of the active river channel. From experience, we expect this to be an important factor for Mercaria survival. We then also have human activity. I will put them together here in one box. That includes protection of areas. It includes building check dams. And it includes the fortification of riverbanks. So just to recapitulate, protection of areas refers to conservation areas. Check dams are particular structures built in rivers to regulate sediment flow. And riverbank protections are protections on the actual riverbank, either with concrete, rocks, or solidified earth. Now, ultimately, of course, we also know about plant survival. The target that we most care about. So let's arrange these in a causal diagram. So we expect altitude to be a source or root of a diagram, because nothing else will change the altitude of a site. Our behavior cannot move mountains, and if we change the channel width, we certainly do not change anything's altitude. So we can expect that if there's an arrow at all, it will go out of altitude, potentially to all these places. We expect altitude to govern both human behavior, plant survival, and the width of a channel a priori. Now, if we have a look at the relationship between channel width and plant survival, then we see that the active channel is expected to affect the survival of a plant and not vice versa. And now we are very interested in human behavior. Human behavior is an interesting factor since it is a main target of our study to understand the effect of human behavior on the remaining variables. We expect that human behavior might impact channel width and might also impact plant survival. And this is a conceptual preliminary arrangement of our variables in a causal diagram. So far, we've treated human behavior as one monolithic entity. However, in reality, we assess area protected check dams and protected riverbanks separately. So let's rearrange this. So rather than having one arrow out of all of these, since we assess these as separate variables, we should also evaluate their effect separately. So rather than this one arrow here, we have separate arrows. And these could also impact channel width. Now remember that earlier, when we looked at our toy model for dengue and malaria, we said that the two variables, temperature and humidity, because they shared neither an arrow between them nor a confounder, must be independent. Now we do not expect all these human effects to be independent because people have reasons to do them. We have reasons to build a check dam because we build a check dam presumably to protect agriculture or near human settlements. These might be much the same reasons we build riverbanks. So we can't expect them to be independent. We need to somehow account for this in our diagram. Since, however, we are not interested at this very moment in understanding the reasons for human behavior, we isolate these with a vague latent variable, as it is called. So this is a variable we do not explicitly have in our study, but exists in the background, called human behavior in principle, which has arrows to all these human factors. Now we also need to make sure that we have altitude accounting for those factors explicitly. So we are interested in the effects of altitude on those, but their mutual correlation, their confounding, will be governed through this latent variable of human behavior. That means we do not have to understand what happens inside this box and can still model these as separate entities. Now we have our initial causal diagram, complete with latent variables. This diagram represents all putative causal relationships between the variables from our dataset. Note that so far we have not made any use of the actual data itself. So now we consult our data to test whether there is any actual evidence for these relationships. We can do this by computing regression models for each target variable and assess which model fits our data best, using any of a number of statistical tests. So in fact, we saw that the overall model predicting the survival probability of our plant depends mainly, or only as far as we could see for the best fitting model, on fortified riverbanks and the width of the active channel. And it's illustrated here in this graph, where the dotted line shows the probability of the disappearance or extinction of juvenile plants in a given year in a site with protected riverbanks, as a function of the width of the active channel, while the blue line shows sites without riverbank protection. So you see the difference is actually rather drastic, but at the same time the channel width has a massive effect on the disappearance probabilities of juveniles as well. Having done all our statistical tests, we see that a lot of these arrows are not actually corroborated by our data. In fact, it turns out that altitude does not have any direct effect on plant survival. Knowing all of the other factors, the best model for plant survival accounts only for protected riverbanks and the width of the active channel. We equally see that check dams do not have any significant impact on either the width of the active channel or plant survival. While protecting an area only impacts plant survival because it tends to be associated with increased channel width. So we hypothesize that protecting the area actually increases the channel width. So looking at these particular effects, we can now say that we assess channel width and we find a model that accounts for altitude, the protection of areas, and protected riverbanks, while check dams turn out not to be an important factor for channel width. The width of the active channel, as well as the protection of the riverbanks, indeed are the main factors for plant survival. Now, we do not actually know, because we have not tested it in sufficient detail, whether there are those effects here of altitude on human behavior. That's because in our study here, we've explicitly decided not to go into why humans behave in a certain way, because that would force us to look in more detail at these latent human behavioral factors, which is outside the scope of the present study. So those are the dotted and dashed lines, and the straight, or sort of straight, lines that we made here are the lines that actually showcase effects that we have measured. So here we are. This is our final outcome of our study in diagrammatic terms. It shows that plant survival is affected by the width of the active channel and the availability of riverbank protections. This makes a lot of sense because we believe that Murocuria germanica is highly dependent on gravel turnover to survive. And the width of the active channel is a huge predictor for gravel turnover. The wider the channel, the more the gravel turnover will work naturally. On the other hand, if we protect the riverbank, we reduce the scope for gravel shifts on the banks. So this is absolutely coherent with our initial hypotheses, but it concretizes them and makes them precise. So one could even say that the absence of arrows from altitude to plant survival, check dams and protected areas to plant survival is at least as much of an outcome of the study as the presence of the straight arrows that you can see here. From this refined causal diagram, we see that the only variables included in this dataset to have a proven direct effect on Murocuria survival are channel width and riverbank fortifications. Meanwhile, altitude and check dams affect Murocuria survival indirectly. Check dams, for instance, through their impact on the width of the active channel, while riverbank protections affect Murocuria germanica survival both directly and through the mediation of channel width. The framework of causal diagrams has given us some clarity on how human activities affect Murocuria survival. This clarity also forces us to sharpen and critically evaluate our underlying assumptions. Here, we postulated that it is human civilization shaping the river channel, rather than vice versa. However, the river itself is a crucial factor for historic human settlement patterns. Therefore, we really ought to take into account how a pre-existing river structure has itself shaped human behavior. So, the more accurate causal diagram that we can use to guide future research will look more like this. Altitude is still a very important background factor which affects human behavior. But now we know that human behavior may also be affected by pre-human channel width. So let's say, because to give us even a chance to assess it in any detail, pre-industrial era channel width. So we expect an influence of pre-industrial era channel width on human behavior, which of course is also heavily shaped by altitude. And then we can postulate that the new channel width is affected by both pre-industrial era channel width, of course if a river started out wider, it's more likely to be wider now, and human behavior. And that ultimately plant survival will be affected by channel width as the product of pre-industrial era channel width and human activity, as well as an additional effect of human behavior, for instance, through riverbank fortifications. What I particularly enjoy about causal diagrams is that they provide a direction for interdisciplinary research. In this case, we see that interconnected human factors affect Murakari germanica survival in several ways. The latent factors behind human behavior aren't the traditional domain of ecologists. Instead, other experts such as engineers, geologists and hydrologists are better placed to explain why riverbank protections are built in a given area, and sociologists, archaeologists and human geographers study how altitude affects where people choose to build settlements and then other structures. The diagram gives us a modular framework where every field can contribute their component. Beyond all that, causal diagrams can unlock the next rung of what Pearl calls the ladder of causality. The first rung is what we call prediction, passively observing a system and predicting the fate of our chosen species. However, as conservationists, we do not want to merely observe a failing system, we want to intervene to improve it. This brings us to the next rung, where we intervene on a factor to elicit a change in the system. To assess such interventions, the directions of effect are crucial. For example, in this case study, we can intervene on an area by giving it protected status and seeing whether this increases year-on-year survival, following this change along the direction of arrows in our diagram. The third and highest rung of the ladder of causality are counterfactuals, where we can reason about what would have happened had something been different in the past. So, in this example, we could reason about whether Murakari germanica would have survived in an area if no riverbank protections had been built there. This allows us to understand how previous decisions have shaped today's ecosystem. Somewhat surprisingly, it turns out that our causal diagram and associated probabilities are insufficient to answer such questions. They require an even more fine-grained, mechanistic understanding of the system under investigation. Pearl's notion of causality and the concept of a causal diagram has great potential to bring together experts from different disciplines. It enables researchers to look beyond their own communities and integrate existing knowledge from other disciplines to understand the system holistically. This is especially important in the face of today's environmental challenges and the difficulty piecing together findings from various different disciplines and institutions. In this way, causal diagrams can be a first step to achieving greater integration of the different communities of applied ecology, helping to pave the way for a more harmonious existence between humans and nature. If you're interested in learning more about all the different concepts of causality and the different rungs of the causal ladder, I can very much recommend the Book of Why by Judea Pearl and Dana Mackenzie. It is, in my opinion, the best popular science book I've ever had the pleasure to read, so if you're interested in more, just pick a copy from your local bookstore.